Hello, my lovelies! The plan for today is to cover the to fabric part of embroidery, everything from where your pattern is printed out and you're ready to get started. I covered my method for making designs and patterns last week, and the video is linked down below. If you don't want to watch it right now, the only thing that you need to know to watch this video is that I recommend making your patterns exactly the same size as the size that you want your final product to be. I don't think there's much more to say than that, so let's get ready to sew. To start off, you're going to need to get your hands on a hoop. The rule of thumb for embroidering is that size-wise, your hoop should fit in your hands comfortably and that you should be able to support it with one hand without strain. For most people, this is about a 15 centimeter hoop like this one, maybe a 20 centimeters. However, this is a rule of thumb and those two sizes are pretty small, so if you have the opportunity, I would recommend playing around with a couple of sizes to see what works for you. You can also get frame stands, which makes it easier to work on larger pieces, but they're more expensive, so you might prefer to get a couple of hoops under your belt first so you know that you'll stick with embroidery as a hobby. I would also advise caution when picking out your first hoop. At the moment, embroidery is having a bit of a resurgence, which means on Amazon and other websites, and even in a lot of stores, there's a lot of really cheap hoops floating around, which seem like a really good deal, and they are, but not to actually embroider in. They tend to not be particularly good quality. In particular, I'm looking at the bamboo ones here that you can get for a couple of quid. This is a particularly bad example, but out of a pack of 10, there were 2 misshapen to this degree. It's a bit trickier to see, but it also has a lot of splinters that I would be concerned about if I was handling it a lot. So I save these guys for framing only. The hoop that I embroider in, I picked up at a charity shop for a couple of quid, but it's far better quality. There are no joins on the outside, it's smooth, and the closure is much smoother to use. The closure also doesn't bend when I close it, so you get a much tighter fit on it. Obviously, there needs to be a joint somewhere on the inside hoop, but the main thing that you're looking for is that the outside ring is complete, aside from the closing mechanism, and that it feels solid and that there are no splinters. You can get plastic hoops as well, but I really have no experience with them. Anyway, long story short, I'm going to display my embroidery in this cheaper hoop, but embroider in this better quality one that I've used many times and I will continue to. So I have a pattern and a hoop. The next thing I need is fabric. As a chronic sewer and stasher, I've managed to get away without ever buying any fabric specifically for embroidery. I keep hold of any cabbage large enough to fit in my embroidery hoop. It does need to be a bit bigger than the hoop though, so this piece for example is just too small, but this one is just right. If I'm using a piece that's got a lot of straggly bits, I'll cut them off to stop them getting in the way. And if it's a larger piece, I'll cut off about the right size to stop it from becoming unwieldy. In terms of fabric weight and material, I mostly embroider on cotton or cotton blends, partly because that's what the majority of my stash is, but also partly because they're so well behaved. As a beginner, you're looking for something that's fairly crisp, but not too thick. You need to be able to see light through it. So quilting cottons are usually a safe bet if you're not sure where to start. You can embroider on stretch for a design on a t-shirt or stockings, for example, but you will need to stretch it out to the size that it will be worn in order for the design to look good when it's finished. If you're not doing it for a garment, I would avoid stretch because it's much easier to pull it out of shape in general. Personally, I've never used any stabilizers, partly because I mainly do decorative embroidery, which doesn't need them, and partly because of the fabric choices that I use, which again doesn't need them. If you're using a particularly difficult fabric, or you're doing a garment and want to make it more hard wearing, that's the time to look into these, but unfortunately I can't give you any advice in this video. I'm sure there's plenty of tutorials out there that can help with that sort of thing if that is something that you want to look into doing. Color-wise, I normally have an idea in my head when I start up what I want to work with. Because I'm working from limited fabric and floss, I'll pick them out together. So for example here, I know that I want green and purple, but I also know that I'm fairly low on greens and only have one purple, but have a load of green fabric. So I pulled out the floss first and tried them against some of the greens that I have, decided they were all too blue, and then moved to this undyed piece of cotton instead. I'm probably actually going to go shopping for a better purple when I get a chance in this case, so I'll take the fabric and the other flosses along with me and compare them in store as close to a window as possible for the natural light. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you pick your fabric or your floss first, as long as you have one in hand when you pick out the second. You can also use pattern fabrics, and I've seen people do some beautiful work on them, but you have to work extra hard to get the colour matching right and to make sure that the end result isn't too busy and the design stands out from the pattern. The one type of pattern that I love to use is one that's the same colour as the fabric, like a jacquard, because then it just adds texture without getting too busy. When picking floss, again, it's very tempting to go for those big, cheap packs of multicolours, and I did that too when I started out. However, they're cheap for a reason, and they tend to shred when you sew with them. On this design, where the stems get thinner towards the end isn't design, that's where the floss shredded, and this is all the floss that I had left when I reached the end of the stem. As an experienced embroiderer, I can work around this now, but when I started, this almost stopped me in my tracks, so I tend to argue against them for beginners and recommend that you go for branded. Anchor and DMC are the main ones, and both are excellent. I've never had any problems with them. Check charity or second-hand stores if you can, though, because sometimes you'll find them in there, and in stores they quite often go on offer. All the multicoloured ones I have here I got from a massive sale in a craft store where they were reducing their flosses. The next step is to get your fabric loaded into your hoop. As with any type of sewing, you should pre-wash and iron your fabric before you start. Once that's done, load your fabric into your hoop with the fashion side on the inside of the hoop. There's two reasons for this. It makes it much easier to transfer your pattern, and it's easier to keep the tension on the fabric. Speaking of tension, your fabric should be tight as a drum once your hoop is fastened. I like to give it a tap to make sure I'm happy with the tension before I get going. You can re-tighten it once you're going if you need to, but it's good practice to start off with it as good as possible, because the more that you adjust it later, the more likely it's going to get out of shape or even be pulled out of the hoop altogether. Now, taking my pattern, I'm going to cut around it. This is one of the reasons that I mark the circle on it, but if you don't have that, you need to cut it small enough to fit in your hoop, but large enough to tape around it without covering any of the pattern. Speaking of taping the pattern, I use masking tape, because it doesn't leave residue but will hold well enough for the job. 3 pieces normally does the job, although if it's a square design I'd use 4. With it stuck on, you can see why it's better to put the fabric in the hoop this way round. The next step is to use a light source behind your hoop to start transferring the design. If you have a light box, that's perfect, or I've used a laptop screen that could go flat in the past as well. You can get apps for tablets that will basically give you a white screen so they can be used as a light box too. But the other option is just to hold your design up to the window and use what nature gives us. Your arms will get tired though. When I'm not trying to lean over a camera, I usually try and sit on a chair and lean on the windowsill. Ideally, you want to transfer your design in one go without a break, because the less that you shift it, the more exact your tracing will be. However, of course, that isn't always possible, and the tape is there to make sure that if you do have to stop, you should be able to get back to it without struggling to line everything up again. If you do need to stop to sharpen a pencil, for example, then try and do it at the end of a section where there'll be less of a join if things do get a touch out of alignment. If your design is larger than your hoop, it's a bit more tricky. Aziraphale's border was, and you can see that I managed to pull it out of shape a bit where I was dealing with it. What I did for him was taped the whole length to the fabric without putting it into the frame, and then lightly drew out the border, which I could then use as a reference to realign the fabric when I finished each segment. It's not ideal, and this is part of the issue of having a small hoop, but with a bit of patience and being exact as possible, you should be able to make it work. I normally make sure that there's a bit of tracing from the last section is in the new section to give me something to line up against as well. When transferring your pattern, the most important thing is that what you're using is sharp and can be kept so that you can get the detail exact, and that it's removable when you finish. You can get special pens designed for this, which I haven't tried, so can't recommend, or chalk pencils, which I've only had bad experience with. I wouldn't recommend Taylor's chalk by itself because it really isn't precise enough and it tends to wear off too quickly. Personally, I get really good results from watercolour pencils. If you haven't used these before, these are not normal colouring pencils. I'm not sure what's different exactly in the makeup, but when drawing they can be used with water to give a watercolour effect, so they're water soluble, which is perfect for then removing them. I normally pick a colour that's a slightly darker shade than the colour of the fabric I'm working on, so in this case I'm using a tan For a green fabric, I would use a darker green. Obviously the exception to this is dark colours, so for black I use a white pencil. As with anything new, make sure you try it beforehand so you know how it works and you're comfortable that you can get it off at the end of the process. And with all of your design traced onto your fabric, you're good to go. Take your hoop away from the light source to make sure that everything is transferred, and when you're happy with it, flip it over and the tape should just pull away from the fabric. I usually peel it off the pattern as well in case I want to reuse it at any point. Cut yourself a length of floss. The rule of thumb for any hand sewing is that your thread should be roughly the same length as your forearm in order to reduce the tangling. So I cut twice that, giving me the right length once it's threaded. A big rookie mistake is not to split your floss, and I also fell for this trap on my first go round. Embroidery floss normally comes with 6 strands, but you don't need to use all 6 on your piece, and 90% of the time it's better not to. I use 2 most often, occasionally going to 3 or down to 1. Generally, the less floss, the more detail you'll be able to capture and the finer your stitches will be, but of course it will take longer. Single thread your needle, which should be fairly short and sharp. You'll need something with a fairly big eye, but the smaller you can get away with threading, the better, because it will go through the fabric easier. Do not let anyone shame you for using a needle threader. They're there to help you. And if it means that you can use a finer needle, then you're using it just as it was designed. Once you've got your thread threaded, pop a knot in the end. I normally double knot single or double strands and single knot triple strands. You don't want too much bulk, but just enough that you can pull it taut without it coming through the fabric. If it comes through to start off with, just add another knot. When picking which stitches to use, there really isn't a right or wrong answer because it heavily depends on the embroidery and which stitches you like to use. I'm not going to be covering all of the stitches in this video because we would be here until the end of time. Just remember that if you don't like the stitch that you ended up with, it's not too hard to unpick, just go slow and steady. This also goes for any mistakes, as long as you're patient, they should come undone. If you get a knot in your thread, again, slow and patient normally wins the day. Very often you can undo a knot simply by putting your needle through the loop and pulling, although if this doesn't work with a light pull, don't force it. And when you're done, take a clean damp cloth to it to erase any marks from the transfer. Don't rub, just dabbing should be enough to remove it, and rubbing can knock things like French knots out. Then iron it to get rid of the marks from the hoops and you're ready to get it finished, which will be the next video. Probably not anytime soon because I need to go shopping for it, but some point. So, that's my method of setting up embroidery. I hope it helps you out. I know there's a lot to consider when you first start out, but once you've done it a couple of times, it all becomes second nature. You've already got all the tools there, and you can just get on with it. My question for you guys today is, if you were going to embroider or have embroidered for you a motivational hoop, what would it say? The one that I'm working on, the one that you've seen in this video, comes from the great master of all wise words, Terry Pratchett, and it's something that I feel that I need to remember in these times, so I would like to have it on my wall. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you did, please think about giving me a like or subscribing if you're not already for more sewing and costume related content. Thank you so much to all of my subscribers, you mean the world to me. Please stay safe, stay sensible, and I shall see you again shortly. Bye!